Good morning. My name is Kristin Kosyluk, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of South Florida in the Department of Mental Health, Law, and Policy. And I'm here with Miss Jenny Tran, who is a doctoral student at the University of South Florida in the College of Behavioral and Community Sciences in the interdisciplinary PhD program. And we're here to present to you on a research project that we've been working on for the past year, titled Stigma Resistance Among Individuals with Concealable Identities. Both of us are affiliated with the Stigma Action Research, or STAR Lab, at USF. And the STAR Lab is dedicated to doing community engaged research to understand and address the stigma surrounding mental health conditions. Okay, so though Jenny and I are here presenting together to you today, we have multiple other collaborators on this project. Dr. Kyan Connor is an associate professor also in the Department of Mental Health, Law, and Policy at USF. Dr. Ruth Furman is at Brown. Dr. Phil Janos is at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. Erica Anderson is another doctoral student in the College of Behavioral and Community Sciences and the Community and Behavioral Sciences PhD program. Shahida Salam was a Master's of Public Health student when working on this project with us, and is now a graduate student at another university. Dr. Jerome Gallia is a assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of South Florida. Dr. Chichin Chu is an associate professor in the Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling program, and also the program director of the Mental Health Counseling, Rehabilitation and Mental Health Counseling program at USF. And finally, Dr. Molly Franke is at Harvard Medical School. And all of our collaborators bring to this project unique perspectives, unique expertise, various experience with working with different types of disabilities. So our presentation overview. First, we're going to give you some background information on the process of stigma, including the impact of specifically self-stigma on individuals living with mental health conditions. And then we're going to look a little bit at what we mean by stigma resistance. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the microphone over to Jenny, and she is going to present to you on the overview of the methods we adopted for our study, which was an integrative review of the literature on stigma resistance. She'll share with you our findings, and then I'll wrap up quickly by talking about the discussion and implications. So first, what is stigma? Or perhaps the better question to ask first is, what are the origins of mental illness stigma? Where does stigma come from? I want to give a content warning quickly before I present the next few slides. In order to illustrate for you where stigma comes from, I'm going to show you some examples. And some of the imagery is a little bit disturbing, so just practice care as you're watching. So we see examples of stigma in the headlines. So an example is in July of 2002, there was a fire at Trenton State Hospital. And we know that state hospitals are a place where many people with serious mental illnesses receive treatment. So what was the Trentonian, so the newspaper, the local newspaper's headline the next day? Roasted nuts. So imagine being either a resident of the state hospital or a family member or loved one of somebody who was receiving care in the state hospital and coming upon this headline, or even just being a member of the community. I mean, this is a really terrible way of sharing news of a tragedy that happened to people living with serious mental illnesses. There has been some research that's been done. I'm going to move the camera a little bit so you can see the full title here. On news media coverage of mental illness across time. So this was in Health Affairs, the journal Health Affairs by McGinty and colleagues. And it was this research was looking at trends in news media coverage of mental illness in the US between 1995 and 2014. So you're not meant to be able to read the text here, but what I want to show you is this next slide, which illustrates where you're seeing the red boxes. These are significant increases over the course of time. So between 1995 and 2005, or I'm sorry, 2014, there was a 22% increase in the coverage of mass shootings. Oops, I'm sorry. I've lost control of my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so a 22% increase, I believe that is, in the coverage of mass shootings. And if we look down here, there's also been a significant increase in the number of, and let me back up, mass shootings and their connection with mental illness. Okay, so the depiction of somebody with a mental illness as being the perpetrator of a mass shooting has increased over time. And we know that the pairing of violence and mental illness, according to research on predictors of violence, is a false one. So people with mental illness are actually no more likely to be the perpetrators of crime than people without mental illness. In fact, people with mental illness are far more likely to be the victims of crime than the perpetrators. And then not only has there been an increase in this coverage of mass shootings as it relates to people with mental illness, but also this has been more likely to make front page news. And if we went one step farther, I would venture to guess that we probably haven't seen that much of an increase in the coverage of recovery stories across time as they highlight the abilities and the strengths of people with mental illness. So we're continuing to see this negative coverage. We also see it in advertising. So although not directly related, very highly correlated. So we know that 90% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental health condition. This is career builder thinking they're being clever in their advertising strategy on the top of a bus writing "don't jump." So the implication is, don't jump, we're going to get you a job and then you will no longer have the desire to die by suicide. Definitely not something that is helpful when it comes to stigma surrounding mental illness. And then finally, another example in advertising. This is a donut chain in California called Psycho Donuts. You can see the tagline here is "crazy good." Crazy is a pretty offensive term from the perspective of many mental health advocates or people living with mental illness, not all, but many. But here's where the imagery and the language gets a little bit more disturbing. So the imagery here, reminiscent of Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. If you've seen that film, she did not treat people living with mental health conditions very well. And the language or the text here reads, "A trip to Psycho Donuts is a sensory experience designed to bring out the crazy in all of us. Psycho nurses are on hand to provide bubble wrap therapy to minimize your selection anxiety." So minimizing the power of psychotherapy in the lives of people living with mental health conditions, comparing it here to bubble wrap therapy. And then also selection anxiety, comparing selecting a donut and anxiety over selecting a donut to the real debilitating anxiety that can come along with a formal diagnosis like generalized anxiety disorder, for example. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see probably what is to me the most disturbing part of this establishment, which is the Psycho Donuts padded cell. So inside these donut chains, you can go and have your picture taken inside the Psycho Donuts padded cell. And for any of us who have either ourselves or someone we love or worked in a capacity where we're familiar with inpatient psychiatric settings, there are padded rooms do exist in inpatient settings. They are used in the most extreme of circumstances, to keep people safe from harming themselves or others when they're incredibly agitated. And they're like the means of last resort in terms of intervention. But for those people who've actually had to use a padded room, it's it's an incredibly traumatic experience. And so capitalizing on this for advertising purposes in a donut chain is really just totally inappropriate. And then if you so desired, you could even, for their Campbell location, so, you know, not to mention there's multiple locations of this establishment, go on a Google Maps tour of the padded cell if you so desired. Okay, so now that I've talked a little bit about where stigma comes from, let's talk about the stigma process. So stigma is in fact a process that's comprised of three constructs: stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotypes are our cognitions about people with mental illness or about any stigmatized group. Prejudice is the emotional reaction to those stereotypes, and discrimination is the behavior. And I'll go through an example of each. So here, you can see that you're looking at a matrix. This is what's called the stigma types, top types by constructs matrix, which was developed by my colleague Patrick Corrigan and I in 2014. There's actually more types of stigma that exist than are listed on this particular slide. Because I pared the matrix down to focus on the types of stigma that are most relevant to today's discussion. You can see on the left-hand side are those constructs that were referenced on the previous slide. So the two types of stigma that we're going to talk about today are public stigma, that's the general public's beliefs about people with mental illness, their emotional reactions, and their discriminatory behaviors. Self-stigma is the internalization of stereotypes and an emotional reaction to that internalization, and then a form of, I guess one could say, self-discrimination on the part of the person living with a mental health condition. So an example of public stigma, the stereotype might be people with mental illness are dangerous. The prejudice or the emotional reaction would be, I'm afraid of people with mental illness. When we think something is dangerous, we tend to fear it. And the discriminatory behavior would be, I will not hire people with mental illness. I need to look out for my safety and that of my other employees. For self-stigma, the example might be, so let me back up. Discrimination happens in all different settings. So it happens in employment, it happens in community living and participation, it happens in the criminal justice system, it happens in healthcare. But this is just an example that we provided in an employment setting. For self-stigma, the example might be for the stereotype, people with mental illness are incompetent. Like dangerousness, incompetence is another common stereotype surrounding mental illness. The prejudice would be, in this case, all people with mental illness are worthless employees. Again, an employment example. I have a mental illness and therefore I'd make a bad employee. And the discriminatory behavior in this case is what's called the why try effect. Why try seeking a job? I wouldn't be able to succeed at it anyway. So this is a loss of self-esteem or self-efficacy as a result of internalizing stigma. So there's a couple things that have to happen for people to actually internalize stigma. They first have to be aware of the stereotypes. When I present on this topic, which I do quite frequently, I always say, you have to live under a rock not to be aware of the stereotypes based on those slides I just presented to you with the imagery that we're constantly bombarded with in the media. But we might question our agreement with those stereotypes. So we might be aware of the stereotypes, but not agree with them. And then stereotype application has to do with whether one identifies as living with a mental health condition. So in order to self-stigmatize, somebody has to be aware of the stereotypes, agree with them. Not everybody would agree with them. Apply them to themselves. They view themselves as having a mental health condition. And then in that case, the result would be the loss of self-esteem or self-efficacy. So just in summary, there are a few common stereotypes surrounding mental illness. One is dangerousness, which includes beliefs that people with mental illness are unpredictable and violent. Responsibility, we tend to blame and shame people with mental illness, thinking they're responsible somehow for their mental health condition. There's kind of two types of responsibility stereotypes. One is onset responsibility, which is we believe that people with mental illness are responsible for the onset of their mental health condition. However, we do not believe that they're responsible for offset, so they're not in control of their own recovery. And then there's incompetence. These common stereotypes give rise to corresponding prejudices, fear, anger, and pity. And then these give rise to these different forms of discrimination. So discrimination in employment, housing, community inclusion, healthcare, and the criminal justice settings. So how do people come to develop a stigmatized identity? So the circle here on the left-hand side of the slide represents an identity, me. What makes up me? So I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm a partner, I'm an employee, I'm a sports fan. Okay, those might be different things one would say about oneself, like their identity. When somebody, there are certain moments in time for specifically for people living with mental health conditions where their identity is, I guess you could say, challenged. For people living with mental health conditions, these types of transitional events can include hearing a diagnosis, so labeling, experiencing repeated hospitalizations, applying for disability, resigning oneself to the permanence of illness. And when this happens, for some folks, not all folks, but for some folks, they experience what's called role engulfment. So instead of having, as in the left-hand side of the slide, all these different aspects of their identity, those still exist, but notice they're very, very small now. They're the person's role as mother, sister, sports fan is scrunched into this little itty bit of what's left of me, and the identity of a person with a mental illness takes over the larger part of the person's identity. So this is what we call role engulfment, and this is the process people undergo when they develop a stigmatized identity. And the term role engulfment was kind of introduced in 1999 by Dr. Stephen Lally to describe this process of developing a stigmatized identity. So here's a quote that I just think is so powerful from a woman living with a mental health condition. Her name is Kathleen Gallo. And this is in a 1994 publication called Self-Stigmatization. So I perceived myself quite accurately, unfortunately, as having a serious mental illness, and then therefore as having been relegated to what I called the social garbage heap. I tortured myself with the persistent and repetitive thought that people I would encounter, even total strangers, did not like me and wished that mentally ill people like me did not exist. Thus, I would do things such as standing away from others at bus stops and hiding and cringing in the far corners of subway cars, thinking of myself as garbage. I would even leave the sidewalk in what I thought as exhibiting the proper deference to those above me in social class. The latter group, of course, included all other human beings. To me, that always almost brings tears to my eyes, because to think about somebody experiencing this level of depleted self-esteem as a result of their experience with a mental health condition, it's just really powerful and moving, and I think something that we need to help people to overcome. So that, speaking of overcoming, when we talk about the process of recovery, it's really about moving people. So now you're seeing what was previously the circles on the right-hand side of the slide that represented role engulfment. Now they're on the left, right? So somebody's experienced this role engulfment, they've had a diagnosis, maybe multiple hospitalizations, maybe applied for disability benefits, and their identity of mother, wife, or partner or sister has become only a small part of who they are, and mental illness identity has taken over. Recovery is this arrow. This is the journey of recovery, which brings people back to seeing themselves more as a whole identity, including all those other identities that existed previously. Key here is it doesn't necessarily mean erasing the mental illness identity. For some people living with mental illness, either they don't want to erase the identity, or because of the ongoing presence of symptoms that might never fully go away, they might not be able to erase that identity completely. But the goal is for it not to make up such a large part of their identity, and that is recovery. So then the question becomes, how commonly do people develop self-stigmatized identities? And the answer is roughly a third of people with serious mental illness develop a stigmatized identity, internalize that stigma surrounding mental illness, and experience the resulting decreased self-esteem and self-efficacy and some other outcomes that we'll talk about momentarily. How is this measured? There's multiple measures of mental illness, internalized stigma of mental illness. One of the scales that's commonly used is called the internalized stigma of mental illness scale. And findings using this scale consistently hover around 20 to 40% of people living with a serious mental illness have elevated internalized stigma. And then there's multiple research studies that have been done looking at the prevalence of internalized stigma among people with serious mental illness, but when it boils down to it, it's roughly 1 in 3 people internalize stigma. So it's not the majority, but it's certainly a substantive amount of people who are affected by this. And if we go back to Kathleen Gallo's narrative, a third of people living like that is it's just too much. We can't have that. I mean, even one person living like that is too much. So there's been some research that's been done looking at outcomes related to internalized stigma. So this article is titled Pathways Between Internalized Stigma and Outcomes Related to Recovery in Schizophrenia Spectrum Disorders. So this is just among people living with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And what Filianos and colleagues found in this study is these relationships. So moving from left to right here, internalized stigma is significantly negatively related to hope and self-esteem. So the higher somebody's level of internalized stigma, the lower their level of hope and self-esteem. Hope and self-esteem is negatively related to avoidant coping. So framing this in a way that we can relate it to internalized stigma, the lower somebody's level of hope and the lower their level of self-esteem, partially as a result of internalized stigma, the more avoidant coping strategies they're going to use. And if you are familiar with avoidant coping, it's generally considered to be a maladaptive coping, so not a good thing. Looking towards the bottom of this path diagram, there's a negative relationship between hope and self-esteem and depressive symptoms. So the lower somebody's sense of hope, they're lower their sense of self-esteem, they're lower their depressive symptoms. Hope and self-esteem is also related to social avoidance. So the lower somebody's level of hope and self-esteem, the lower their level of, the higher their level of social avoidance, or we could say the lower their level of social inclusion. So this is a negative outcome for people living with mental illness who internalize stigma, experience lower levels of hope and self-esteem. They're going to experience, they're more likely to experience social avoidance or lower social inclusion. And then finally, what's really the final outcome in this path diagram, I don't think it's necessarily the most important, but it's definitely an important outcome, is psychotic symptoms. So literally internalizing stigma makes symptoms worse. So if you follow the path diagram through, the higher one's internalized stigma, the lower their level of hope and self-esteem. The lower their level of hope and self-esteem, the more socially avoidant they are. The more socially avoidant they are, the higher their psychotic symptoms. So through hope and self-esteem and social avoidance, internalized stigma influences levels of symptoms. So the take-home message, self-stigma strongly predicted lower hope and self-esteem, which in turn predicted more avoidant coping, depressed mood, and greater social avoidance. And then controlling for psychotic symptoms in this study did not affect the strength of those relationships. So even for people who had a lot of psychosis or a lot of psychotic symptoms, or had fewer, these relationships still held. Okay. I'm going to mute myself and pass the mic over to Jenny.
Hi. So we are going to be talking about our study today, again, on stigma resistance strategies. So for our study, again, we were interested in looking at the stigma resistance strategies of individuals with concealable identities, or an identity that is not physically or visibly recognized at first glance. So this included looking at the existing literature on stigma resistance of individuals living with a mental illness, individuals that identified within the LGBTQ plus communities, individuals who have a criminal record, sex workers, individuals with substance use, and individuals living with HIV/AIDS. So our study examines the existing literature in the hopes of kind of applying this information on stigma resistant strategies and other concealable identities in the development and implementation of programs for bolstering stigma resistance strategies in individuals living with mental illness, as this identity is also considered a concealable identity. So due to the broad range of literature on stigma resistance, we conducted an integrative review, which allowed for the inclusion of studies with a variety of methodologies. So we identified some well-known databases of including Web of Science, Medline, Scopus, PsycInfo, and Social Work Abstracts and Dissertation Database. Our search spanned from 2009 to 2020, and we used 3 sets of search terms. The first were terms relating to stigma, so public stigma or self-stigma. We also looked up resistance terms such as coping, resisting, or resist, and then terms for some concealable identities such as LGBTQ+ and HIV/AIDS. Our review was guided by the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions, and was carried out by all researchers. We use a protocol that described the approach for review, which included multiple reviewers analyzing and examining the pooled articles during the screening and data extraction. So consensus was provided during screening, data extraction, and synthesis of the included articles as per the guidelines outlined by Cochrane Collaboration Manual. So here you can see our systematic review flow diagram. We have 644 total abstracts, which we were able to remove 188 duplicates. And using our inclusion and exclusion criteria, multiple reviewers examined 456 abstracts, and 241 articles were found to be irrelevant and excluded for things such as opinion articles, theoretical articles, articles that did not focus on concealable identities, articles that did not focus on stigma-resistant strategies, as well as articles that included participants under the age of 18. So we're currently working on full text screening and data extraction for 208. And today we're going to present on 41 individual studies and some initial findings from these studies that span from various methodologies.
Our slides ended up a little bit out of order. So, I know this is pre-recorded, but you're getting the full in-person experience here. I was questioning as we were going into this, I was thinking, I feel like slides are missing. So no worries at all. We're just gonna go ahead and go with the flow. That's what we do. This was another, so I presented to you, and we'll go back. So Jenny already described to you sort of like our method, the first part of our method. So we'll jump right into the results after I finish up these intro pieces. Apologies for that. So I presented to you that study that Filianos and colleagues did with the path diagram that showed ultimately that internalized stigma can negatively influence or you can increase psychotic symptoms. So here is another study that they did looking at internalized stigma as a barrier to improvement in vocational functioning, again, among people with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. They looked at baseline levels of internalized stigma and controlled for symptoms in this study, and they showed that baseline internalized stigma, even when controlling for symptoms, was negatively predictive of 5-month improvement. So improvement measured 5 months later in vocational functioning. So all of this to say, internalized stigma has a negative impact on vocation or employment. The take-home message, the degree of internalized stigma significantly predicted degree of vocational functioning 5 months later, even when controlling for symptoms. So there's findings that we can pull from research all over the world. I've just pulled in some examples here. So Corrigan and colleagues, as well as Werner and colleagues, found an association between self-stigma or internalized stigma and low self-esteem. It's also been associated in other research here by Klein et al. With avoidant coping and lower self-efficacy. It's been associated in research in Nigeria and China with poor medication and treatment adherence by Edwuya and Sang, and associated with impaired social functioning by Munoz in Spain. In the Netherlands, Starring and colleagues found that high perceived stigma, excuse me, combined with high insight are related to increased depressive episodes, or symptoms, I should say, lower self-esteem and lower quality of life, including some aspects of social functioning. Oops. Let me go back. Okay. And then there was a replication of the finding that insight moderated the impact of self-stigma on demoralization, which in turn impacted functioning by Cavelti and colleagues in Switzerland. So this is an international phenomenon. It's not unique to the United States. And the literature is coming together to show us that self-stigma is something we should be paying attention to. So a meta-analysis of the literature was conducted by Livingston and Boyd in 2010. A meta-analysis is just basically an assimilation of all the studies that have ever been done on the topic, combining them together and looking at what's the overall effect of the phenomenon, in this case, self-stigma, on outcomes. And here, what Boyd and Livingston, or Livingston and Boyd, found is significant effects on hope. So higher self-stigma, lower hope, lower self-esteem, lower self-efficacy, lower quality of life, greater symptom severity, decreased treatment adherence, and poor social support. So stigma resistance is really the capacity of an individual to be unaffected by stigma. And this is a figure kind of, I think it really well illustrates self-stigma, but also the idea of stigma resistance. This one was created by Corrigan and Watson in 2002. And we're using it with permission here. So basically what this figure shows is that in order to self-stigmatize, as we discussed earlier, somebody has to be aware of the collective representations of mental illness. And cognitive crimes are like, what would prime a prime a stereotype? It could be a label, it could be somebody looking at an individual and making an assumption based on maybe their behaviors that they have a mental health condition. But we have these shared collective representations, generally negative, about people with mental illness. and this leads to negative actions by others. Whether or not somebody internalizes those stereotypes, though, depends on how legitimate they perceive them to be. If perceived legitimacy is high, they believe that these are legitimate stereotypes. Example, people with mental illness are dangerous. If they strongly believe that, and if group identification is high, then that is when internalized stigma is the outcome. So again, just as a reminder, this side of the figure, this is the process followed by about a third of people with serious mental illness. If they don't highly identify with the group, they might be indifferent to this. So they might not care one way or the other. The other end of the continuum here is when somebody is low on perceived legitimacy, they don't agree with the stereotypes, and high on group identity. Okay, so they do believe that they belong to the group of people with mental illness. What can happen here is what's called righteous anger. This is kind of the energy that fuels activism. But I'd also say that part of this could be stigma resistance. So sorry, my mouse is jumping around a little bit. So this is kind of the opposite end of the continuum to internalized stigma. So now Jenny can jump into this slide. Jenny, I'll let you kind of just do your thing in terms of if you feel like there's stuff that you need to cover here before you move on to your next slides.
Okay, so again, just to reiterate some of our study here, we are going to be looking at stigma resistance, like Dr. Kosyluk said, and that's what we're interested in, and being able to apply those stigma resistance strategies to aid individuals on the other side of the spectrum with internalized stigma. Again, we used an integrated review looking at what stigma resistance strategies are used by other individuals with concealable identities. So, next slide. So this is just, again, a review of our methods. We did a literature search from 2009 to 2020. And again, we followed some of the Cochrane collaboration manual in our review using multiple reviewers for consensus. Next slide. So we're going to be presenting our results, again, just from 41 articles for preliminary findings of 41 different studies. They came from a variety of different countries, as you can see there. A majority of them were from the United States. However, we have a couple in China and Ghana and a few of other countries here you can see. The 41 studies encompass a variety of concealable stigmatized identities. A majority of them included individuals living with mental illness and sexual orientation identity, criminal record, sex workers, HIV/AIDS, and substance use. The articles encompassed quantitative methods as well as qualitative and mixed methods. Again, this is why we wanted to use an integrated review, which would allow us to encompass multiple different methodologies. And based off of this, there were a variety of different study designs, including articles conducting interviews or surveys, focus groups as well. Next slide. So our results here, we're going to be presenting on our findings again from the 41 studies. And the synthesis of the data revealed 6 overarching stigma resistance strategies. The first one here is identity transparency, which includes the decision of concealment or disclosure of identity and the delineation of public and private roles for individuals. Next, please. The second stigma resistance strategy we came upon in the 41 articles is this idea of social relatedness, which includes availing peer support, family support, and various social networks to aid in resisting stigma. Next, please. Our third stigma resistance strategy is this conceptualization of otherness. So this includes differentiating from or incorporating within oneself aspects of the marginalized identity, either challenging or rejecting the label, the identity pride within the identity of the concealable, a marginalized identity, rejection of some stereotypes, and acknowledging or appreciating some intersections of identities. So if the individual encompass multiple marginalized identities. Next slide, please. The fourth stigma resistance strategy are coping strategies. So this includes incorporating efforts, both behavioral and psychological, that assist with tolerating, reducing, or minimizing the impact of stigma on oneself. Here is a list of some of these coping strategies that were utilized or presented within the articles, such as apathy, self-acceptance, self-compassion, mindfulness, meaning making, and focusing on strengths. Next. The fifth stigma resistance strategy is education. So this includes educating oneself and others about one's identity and the impact of stigma. And then our last stigma resistance strategy is the structural, contextual, and historical processes. This includes activism and volunteerism in the areas of relevance to the marginalized identities.
Okay. So our colleague in this work, Dr. Ruth Furman, who we mentioned earlier, has done some work in previous to this work that we're doing together now in stigma resistance, and has talked about some of these strategies in this work, and also has conceptualized these strategies as taking place at 3 different levels. So at the personal level, or the level of the self, at the peer level, and at the public level. So you can see here in this figure that some examples of strategies for stigma resistance that might take place at the level of the self include not believing stigma. So that's that perceived legitimacy piece. Or catching and challenging stigmatizing thoughts. So there are programs that exist out there that are meant to help us to cognitively restructure, to erase stigmatizing thoughts. At the peer level, some examples might be using your lived experience to help others. So we oftentimes see people who have experienced a mental health condition and are have moved through into recovery, are wanting to give of themselves to their peers in order to help them through similar challenges. And then at the public level, some strategies might be, as Jenny mentioned just a moment ago, advocacy, and then doing activities that challenge or confront or question stigma. So just keeping in mind that this can happen at all different levels. And one of the things I neglected to mention earlier is kind of the justification for doing this work. And there are several programs that exist for challenging self-stigma when it's actually already taken hold. So somebody has a serious mental illness, they've received a diagnosis, they maybe have been hospitalized multiple times, they are aware and agree with the stereotypes, and then they internalize stigma. Examples of such programs include narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy, which is developed by Phil Yanos and colleagues, and then also Honest, Open, Proud, which is developed by Patrick Corrigan and colleagues, and I've had a role in that program. So Honest, Open, Proud is a disclosure-based self-stigma reduction program, and NECT, or Narrative Enhancement and Cognitive Therapy, is a as the title suggests, it's based in narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy. So refuting these negative stereotypes or challenging stigmatizing, self-stigmatizing thoughts. So again, this is when stigma has already taken root. So this brings us into our discussion. Why I think the findings of our work are important is because we would envision developing interventions using these findings, specifically interventions that are targeted at the early intervention end of the continuum. Maybe when somebody is first experiencing a diagnosis, before they've had a chance to allow self-stigma to take hold, can we help them to bolster some of these strategies within themselves, utilize some of these strategies in order to thwart self-stigma from ever taking root in the first place. The implications are huge, right? We presented to you data that show that people that self-stigmatize experience worse outcomes in terms of quality of life, self-esteem, hope, symptoms, treatment adherence, the list goes on, employment. So the potential benefits of a program like this, if we could help people to avoid self-stigma from the very beginning, are huge. And then there's also applications to various stigmatized identities. So we mentioned that we're looking at various stigmatized identities that are also concealable identities that are stigmatized, like mental health conditions. And so some of these strategies, some might apply to all concealable stigmatized conditions. Some might only apply to some. I personally would envision that the findings, when we're done with this integrative review of the literature, that our findings would be taken to communities of people with lived experience, providers, community agencies, basically a community advisory board of individuals who can help us make sense of what we've found and who can make suggestions about what might and might not work for specific communities. So we could have a stigma resistance program that targets people with mental illness, a stigma resistance program that is meant to benefit people who identify as members of the LGBTQ+ communities, a stigma resistance program meant to benefit people with HIV, AIDS. You can see where I'm going, the list goes on. So this really highlights the benefit of our cross-disciplinary collaborations with our list of colleagues that we presented to you at the beginning. All of us come from diverse disciplines and areas of expertise, and is really making this work exciting and fun. And I hope it will make it also impactful. So that is all that we have for you today. We thank you so much for attending, for bearing with us through some of the technical difficulties. But again, hope that made it a little bit more realistic for you. If you're interested in connecting with us about our work, you can reach me by email at kosyLuk@usf.edu. I think my profile will probably be available on the conference website. We also have a STAR Lab email, which is all capitals star-lab@usf.edu if you'd rather contact us there. Thank you so much. Have a good day.